Hi Matrix. We are now creating a series of videos that you are going to need to access and watch, particularly on the days that you are not at school. And the point of uploading so many of them at the same time is so that you can download them before you go home, so that you don't have to worry about your data affecting the accessibility of the videos. So basically, what's going to happen is every Thursday, I'm going to upload the next 5 lessons, which would be the next 5 days of work. And it's up to you to either download all of them or download the ones that you are going to be at home for, so that you can watch the videos in the lesson time and you can stay on track. Because remember, we are not going to be reteaching every day what was taught. Instead, we are going to progress through the topic like we normally would in class. And so that means that if you didn't come into school on the Monday, you need to watch Monday's video so that when you're there on Tuesday, we can pick up where we left off. So we're going to start our new topic today, which is evolution by natural selection, and we are on page 265 if you want to follow along in your textbook. So let's first of all dive into some questions around evolution, and these questions are really common, and I'd like to just touch on them briefly so that we sort of all start on the same page and have some kind of similar understanding surrounding evolution. And a really common thing that we can obviously start off with is, what exactly is evolution? Now, a very common sort of misunderstanding, and that often affects people's understanding of evolution, is that humans evolved from monkeys, which isn't true, and it's not the case. And to sort of wrap your head around the fact that yes, monkeys are in our family, it doesn't automatically mean that humans came from monkeys or that monkeys are going to continue to evolve into humans. I think that's a very big misunderstanding that sort of hovers around this topic, and it sort of clouds over what the real understanding of evolution is. And we are going to go into that, and we're going to look at the difference between what's evolution versus biological evolution, because they're not actually the same thing. I also want to touch on briefly, because I do think it's important to look at whether or not you believe in evolution. And I will say that every cultural and religious idea that you may have is important for you to keep that while we go through this topic. And instead, you should view this as seeing alternative ideas. And I think it's important that if you are educating yourself on something that you might not necessarily believe in, it's important to understand the facts of the other side of the argument. And so in the context of school, we want to present this to you as scientific information that you can take on, and that you can have perhaps a greater understanding of perhaps your own beliefs. Now, if you are looking for proof of evolution, there is a large collection of work that we are going to cover to prove evolution, and it's not just fossils. There are large holes in the fossil record, so relying on fossils to be the only source of evidence for evolution would therefore make evolution quite weak. There needs to be other forms of evolution, and we're going to go, other forms of proof or evidence. We're going to go through the proof and evidence that we have at the moment. Another very common question is, are we still seeing evolution taking place today? And the short answer is yes, we do see evolution today. And we see it in a small scale evolution as well as macro or large scale evolution. And there are many mechanisms that are taking place today that makes evolution observable. Now, how long does evolution take? That's a very difficult question to answer, simply because it is only it's largely based on the environment. The environment is the selective pressure. It is the thing that is determining whether or not evolution's taking place. And you'll see as we go through the topic that the idea of natural selection is literally the foundation of evolution. Is nature selecting what will and won't survive, what will and won't evolve? And so how long does evolution take? Well, that's really based on the environment and the factors affecting the changes in the environment. So let's go into some definitions, and you do need to know these definitions because you need to be able to differentiate between evolution and biological evolution, and this is mentioned in the guideline. So let's look at evolution first, and it says that evolution is a gradual change or development of something over time, and it's gradual, small changes, and this is very linear, meaning it's going in a straight line. There's progressive changes moving towards something that is perhaps better, and something that you could easily associate this with would be something like technology. And so technology is slowly getting better, faster, perhaps more efficient, and that's the idea of basic evolution. But when we speak about biological evolution, we are not just speaking about a gradual change towards a specific goal. Instead, biological evolution does not have a goal to move towards. There is no ideal, there is no perfect, in the sense that an organism may evolve and its evolution may not take a linear progression. It may not move in a straight line. It might move a little bit forwards, a little bit backwards, a little bit to the side. It's not necessarily an organism getting better and better and better with time. And so when we do look at biological evolution, we are looking at a gene pool of a population, and their gene pool is ultimately affected by things like mutations, natural selection, and genetic drift, which allows for change to occur, and that change being evolution. And I'd like to point out that all of these factors, these processes, mutations, natural selection, genetic drift, organisms have no control over these things. It is the environment which is determining what will and won't progress. And a simple idea of what biological evolution is descent with modification. And we've looked at this term before, and what it is an organism that is descending, meaning that it is producing offspring, and over time that offspring may modify and diversify, and eventually you might end up with a very large branched family tree where you started with one common ancestor and then progressively increased your family and increased the amount of branches that you have. And there are two kinds of evolution, and this is very important because people think that evolution means you're making a new species all the time, and that's actually not the truth. You can have microevolution, which is where you are going to evolve small changes within a species. So maybe the change is the color of skin. Just because there are different skin colors doesn't mean that there is a new species being created. It just means there's variation in skin tone. Likewise, there might be slight changes in the beak shape of birds, a particular bird species. That doesn't mean that there's different bird species now. It just means that some of those birds in that species have slightly different shaped beaks, but collectively they are still the same species. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is where we are making a new species that is very different from their parent species or their common ancestor. And in order to know that you're a new species, you won't be able to interbreed with your ancestor. Now, I am going to break that up a little bit more a little bit later on in the slides. There are some examples and exceptions to that rule. But I'll get to that a little bit later on about species and how you actually know you're a new species, and that kind of thing. So another important thing that we need to also look at is what is the difference between a hypothesis and a theory? And this is also something from the exam guidelines. So you are going to have to know the difference between these two and be able to differentiate between the two of them. But before I even get into what those are, I think it's important to just quantify quickly what a fact is. So a fact is the ultimate goal if you're trying to prove something to be true, and effectively it's a statement that is accepted as being true because substituting the statement with the opposite meaning would make it absurd, and the statement is verified by many observers. And observers in the context of evolution is going to be people who specialize in evolution. So how do we actually get to a fact? So whenever you're going to attempt to move towards a fact, you're going to create a hypothesis. And we know from making our scientific method in our experiments that it's an educated guess. You are taking pieces of information and you are interpreting them and you are speculating and formulating a possible outcome. What do you think it could be? Based on what you already know, what could the possible outcome be? And so that's a hypothesis. And a hypothesis must be testable. You must be able to test it, calculate it. You must be able to, in other words, allow there to be some kind of scientific method carried out in order to prove whether it's true or not. Now, once a hypothesis has been tested multiple times, we can then see a theory. And so a theory is an explanation with a large amount of evidence and testing behind it. Therefore, the theory of evolution is regarded as a scientific theory because various hypotheses relating to evolution have been tested and verified over time. In other words, there are many hypotheses surrounding evolution. Where we came from, where we're going to, who are our closest ancestors, who aren't our closest ancestors, where do we fit in the family tree. There's lots of hypotheses that have been tested. And the most important thing about a hypothesis that becomes a theory is that a theory may only remain as a theory if you keep testing the same things and get the same answers. If you test these hypotheses and you do not come to the same conclusion, then the theory can be disproven. And the beauty of science is that theories are not necessarily treated as fixed. The beauty of science is that there should always be change, there should always be input, and so that is why the theory of evolution is, not to be punny and play on words, but it is evolving and changing over time, and the more evidence we collect, the more the theory grows. At this time, we do accept evolution as a fact, just like the theory of gravity is treated as a fact, because up until this point, the repetitive testing and the large amount of evidence, and most importantly, the peer reviewing that has taken place, all leads to the same idea that evolution has taken place and is taking place now. Now, we need to look at the evidence for biological evolution, and we're going to start off with the fossil records. So fossils, if you remember back to grade 10, are preserved remains, bones, teeth, maybe impressions, their footprints, and this is really the foundation of evolution. It provides us a very certain starting point to try and explain and formulate a theory around evolution. And that is because you can't fake the age of a fossil or a rock. Depending on when that fossil was created, you can age the fossil, so you can determine how old it is. And that then gives you a nice timeline of how changes have occurred. Now, The fossil record allows us to look at systematic change over time, and just like the picture on the slide, which shows the evolution of the wing, you can see a systematic change of the bones of the upper limbs, how they've changed, and how they have modified over time. And this is generally due to some kind of environmental change that has occurred, which has allowed for this modification to take place. Now, what can we actually see in the fossil record? Now, the first thing that we always notice in the fossil record is an increase in complexity. And we generally move from the simplest organisms, which are found in the older rocks, to the more complex organisms that would be found in rocks that are younger, meaning they were made more recently. And this is not the only piece of evidence we can use, because an increase in complexity doesn't necessarily mean that something is better either. There are plenty of simple organisms that have remained the same over the course of Earth's existence, and that haven't necessarily need to change or evolve. But in the case of evolution, an increase in complexity is one indicator that evolution has taken place. So moving from perhaps a single-celled organism to multicellular, to having eyes, to having legs, to having lungs, each of these are more complex structures, which is an indication of evolution. Another thing that can be seen in the fossil record is an increase in diversity. In other words, you have a more larger variety of organisms that you can see in the fossil record. So the older rocks would have very little diversity. You'd be finding the same fossils over and over again with very little variety, least diversity. And then the newer rock, the rock that is younger, would have a much larger variety of organisms. The third thing that we can see in the fossil record is intermediate forms. And an intermediate form is an organism that seems to possess more than one characteristic from different groups. And an example, perhaps, that would illustrate this really well is how reptiles evolved into mammals. And we can sort of see examples of organisms that exhibit both reptilian and mammalian characteristics. And this often allows us to see a link between the two groups, and it sort of guides us in terms of where do we place these individuals. So an intermediate organism is an organism that links these two groups and expresses some physical characteristics that both of these groups have. An example of this is the Tiktaalik. The Tiktaalik is an example of an intermediate species, or perhaps also known as a transitional species, as it shows physical characteristics of two groups, or more actually groups. And it's an important fossil that was found as it expressed both fish-like qualities and reptilian-like qualities as well. And you can see by the photograph that it has a mixture between the two, in that it has scales, but it seems as though its forelimbs, its front fins, have taken on a lobed effect to them, which effectively means that there is bone that can be rotated like a shoulder. And you can see also by its face that it has a more of like a crocodile appearance to it, and it seems to also have skin as opposed to scales. The next example of a transitional species was the Megazostrodon, and this little organism here is one of the very first mammalian-like fossils that we've found. It's actually a very common fossil in South Africa, and it shows one of the first mammals. And it is still considered transitional simply because It largely has a lot of mammalian-like qualities. One of the most important one was that it was warm-blooded, endothermic. It could create its own body heat, but it still had a few skeleton-like characteristics that were still similar to terrestrial reptiles. And so even though it largely looks like a mammal, it did have a few anatomy similarities to reptiles at this point. And all of these pieces of evidence allow us to fill in the spaces in between the very large, obvious changes. And that's the beauty of transitional fossils and intermediate fossils, is that they allow us to see what do the organisms look like in between these very drastic changes. So that's it for today's lesson. We're going to pick up with the rest of the bodies of evidence in our next lesson.